New York, Madison Square Garden, October 1970. The building had seen heavyweights trade blows that shook the press row. It had seen crowds of 20,000 reduce themselves to silence in the specific way that large crowds go silent when something happens that no one was prepared for. It had seen the best fighters in the world walk through its corridors with the particular confidence of men who understood that this building was where careers were made and ended. But on this particular October evening, the building was about to see something that none of the 18,000 people filling its lower bowl and mezzanine had a category for. Something that the most experienced fight observers in the audience would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately and never quite managing it. The program listed it as an exhibition match. The word exhibition would turn out to be the most inadequate word in the English language for what occurred on that stage in the 8th minute of the final hour of the evening. His name was Viktor Sokolov. He had been born in 1931 in a small industrial city east of the Ural Mountains, the third son of a steel worker who reportedly said when Viktor was 6 years old that the boy was going to either move the world or break it. By the time Viktor was 12, he was carrying his father's equipment to the factory because his father's back had given out, and someone had to do it. By the time he was 16, he was doing his father's job. By the time he was 20, he had been noticed by a Soviet sports administrator who had been tasked with identifying physical anomalies for the state athletic program. The administrator sent a telegram to Moscow that read simply, "Found something you need to see." Viktor Sokolov arrived in New York in the fall of 1970, having spent the previous decade on the European strongman and combat exhibition circuit, a traveling world of challenge matches and spectacle fights that moved through the Soviet bloc, Western Europe, and eventually the United States. He was not a boxer. He was not a wrestler in any technical sense. He was not a martial artist. What Viktor Sokolov was, in the most precise possible terms, was an event, a geological event that happened to be ambulatory. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 800 pounds. The exact figure was disputed in the days before the match because no standard scale available to the Madison Square Garden staff could confirm it. The number that circulated through the building and eventually through the press corps was 800. Whether it was 780 or 820 did not matter in any practical sense. The man was a continent with a heartbeat. His record, distributed by his manager on a single laminated card to any journalist who asked, listed 72 victories across 11 countries, 41 by knockout, 16 by what the card described as opponent withdrawal, which meant his opponents had stopped fighting of their own volition, 11 by referee stoppage. 0 losses. His method was not complicated. It did not need to be. He moved forward, absorbed whatever his opponent offered, and then applied his hands. Once Viktor Sokolov's hands found a human body, the encounter was over in the same way that an argument with a building is over. You do not win arguments with buildings. You simply suffer the consequence of having started one. Bruce Lee was not supposed to be in New York. His schedule that week had him in Los Angeles working on a project that had been consuming his attention for months, a film concept that he had been developing with a producer who understood what Bruce was trying to build and why it had never been built before. But a phone call from James Coburn, who had been one of Bruce's students and had become one of the few people in the world Bruce trusted to identify something worth seeing, changed the week's plans. Coburn had attended the first evening of the 3-day exhibition that the Madison Square Garden Sports Division had organized around Viktor Sokolov's North American tour. He called Bruce after midnight, and what he said in those few minutes was enough to put Bruce on a plane the following morning. He arrived in New York with Dan Lee, one of his most committed training partners, and was seated 7 rows from the exhibition floor in the right section of the lower bowl. He wore a dark mandarin collar jacket and simple black trousers. He had brought no equipment, no training gear, nothing that suggested he intended to do anything other than what Coburn had suggested, which was to observe. For the first 2 hours of the evening, he did exactly that. He watched quietly, occasionally leaning toward Dan to note something about a technique or a structural flaw in someone's movement. He was relaxed, analytical, enjoying the atmosphere the way a chess grandmaster enjoys watching a tournament in which the players are good but not yet great. Appreciative of the craft, alive to the errors, always running the calculation that never fully stops running. Then the announcer introduced the final act. The building shifted. The noise changed in a way that audiences change when something enters a room that exceeds their existing framework for what a room can contain. A side entrance opened, and Viktor Sokolov walked into Madison Square Garden. The reaction was not applause. It was not booing. It was something more involuntary than either of those things. It was the sound that 9 separate sections of 18,000 people make when their nervous systems register something that their survival instincts immediately classify as a threat to the species. Viktor did not walk so much as redistribute. Each step was a transaction between his mass and the floor beneath him, and the floor was losing. The reinforced ramp that had been constructed specifically to support his entry groaned with each footfall in a way that was audible in the first 12 rows. He wore a sleeveless canvas shirt cut open across the chest and dark trousers that had been custom-made to accommodate thighs that were individually larger than most men's entire lower bodies. His head was shaved. His neck had long since merged with his shoulders into a single uninterrupted mass of trapezius muscle that made his skull appear to rise directly from his chest, like a geological formation. His arms hung at his sides with the resigned heaviness of things that have given up trying to fit anywhere. He reached the center of the raised platform and stood there. And the building processed him the way eyes process an eclipse, with the involuntary recognition that the normal rules of scale do not apply to what is currently being observed. Viktor's manager, a compact Ukrainian man in a dark suit, who moved with the quick precision of someone accustomed to managing logistics that most people would find unmanageable, took the microphone. He listed Viktor's record: 72 victories, 11 countries, no defeats. He explained the format. Viktor would accept challenges from any person in the building, any background, any size, open rules with a referee for safety. Then the manager said something that changed the temperature of the room. He said Viktor had a specific message for any person present who believed that speed and technique could overcome mass in a genuine encounter. He was tired, the manager said, of reading articles by martial arts instructors who claimed that a small, fast man could defeat a large, strong man. He was tired of the philosophy. He wanted the physics. And then Viktor himself spoke. His voice was a low, carrying rumble that needed no amplification to reach every corner of the lower bowl. His words came through the translator in measured, deliberate sequence. He said he had been informed that a well-known martial artist was present in the audience this evening. A Chinese man. A man who taught a style of fighting he had invented himself. A man who appeared in films and on television demonstrating techniques that Viktor Sokolov respectfully described as entertainment. Viktor raised his arm. A single massive finger extended from his hand like a structural beam rotating outward from a crane. The spotlight operator followed the finger. It found Bruce Lee in row 7. 18,000 people turned their heads. Bruce did not move. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his back straight, his eyes already locked on Viktor before the spotlight reached him, as though he had known the finger was coming and had decided exactly what to do with his face when it arrived, which he had. Dan Lee reached over and grabbed Bruce's arm. Whatever Dan said, Bruce did not acknowledge it. His eyes had not moved from the platform. The translator continued. Viktor said he understood that Bruce Lee had dedicated his life to the study of how a small man defeats a large man. He said he respected the dedication, if not the conclusion. He said he wanted to offer Bruce Lee an opportunity to test the conclusion tonight, in front of a building full of witnesses, against the most unambiguous possible counter-argument. Then he said the sentence that 18,000 people would carry out of Madison Square Garden that night and repeat for the rest of their lives. He said, "Tell him that if he comes up here, I will not merely defeat him. I will end him. Not his reputation, his body. He will not leave this building the way he entered it." The building went quiet, in the specific way that very large spaces go quiet when something has been said that makes 18,000 people simultaneously hold their breath. Not silence. The absence of casual noise. The sound of a crowd that has forgotten, for one moment, that it is a crowd and has become instead a single organism waiting to see what happens next. Bruce Lee stood up. There was no drama in the standing. There was no performance. He rose from his seat the way a man rises when he has finished reading something and has understood it completely and has decided what the understanding requires. Dan Lee grabbed his forearm with both hands. Bruce looked at him, said something. Dan released his grip. Later, Dan would say that Bruce said only 3 words. "Not now, Dan." Bruce moved along the road toward the aisle. The man seated at the end of the row stood up automatically, the instinctive courtesy of someone making room, and then seemed to realize what he was making room for, and stood there with his mouth slightly open. Bruce reached the aisle and turned toward the platform. The walk from row 7 to the platform stairs was perhaps 20 feet. In those 20 feet, the building found its voice again. It rose in layers. First individual voices, then sections, then the whole lower bowl, producing a sound that was equal parts warning, encouragement, and the particular human noise that emerges when a large group of people recognizes that something irreversible is beginning to happen and cannot decide whether to stop it or witness it. A man near the platform stairs reached out as Bruce passed and put his hand briefly on Bruce's shoulder. Not to stop him. The gesture was something older and more instinctive than that. Something like the way a crowd touches a man walking toward something they believe he may not return from. Bruce climbed the stairs and stepped onto the platform. The platform had groaned and flexed under Viktor's entry. Under Bruce's weight, it registered nothing. He walked to the center of the raised surface and stopped. And for the first time, the 18,000 people in Madison Square Garden understood the full dimensions of what was about to happen. Standing 30 feet from Viktor Sokolov, Bruce Lee appeared to belong to a different category of organism entirely. Viktor's chest was at Bruce's eye level. Viktor's shadow fell across Bruce completely under the overhead lights. Viktor's single hand, hanging at his side, was larger than Bruce's head. Several people in the front rows described the same physical sensation in interviews conducted years later. A cold, dropping feeling in the stomach. The specific nausea of watching something that your nervous system classifies, correctly and immediately, as disproportionate. The referee was a retired boxing official named Harold Weeks, who had worked rings across the country for 15 years and had seen things that most people who loved the sport would rather not know about. Weeks stood between the two men, and his face communicated something that referees are trained never to communicate, which was his own opinion of whether a contest should proceed. He looked at Bruce with the expression of a man who wants very badly to say something he does not have the authority to say. Bruce met the look and gave a single small shake of his head. Not argumentative. Final. Weeks conferred briefly with the event coordinator. The coordinator looked at Bruce. Bruce's expression did not change. The coordinator looked at Viktor's manager. The manager smiled the smile of someone who has been in this position many times and knows how it ends. Weeks was overruled. He returned to the center of the platform and explained the rules in a voice that was slightly less steady than it had been at the start of the evening. No strikes to the eyes or throat. No weapons. Everything else permitted. Both men indicated their understanding. Viktor with a sound from deep in his chest that was not quite a word. Bruce with a single nod. Weeks looked at Bruce one final time. The look lasted 2 seconds. Then Weeks raised his hand. The building dropped to a hush so complete that the overhead ventilation system became audible for the first time all evening. Weeks brought his hand down. Viktor moved immediately, not charging, not rushing, but advancing with the inexorable certainty of a tide coming in, both arms beginning to spread wide as he closed the distance, the motion of something that has absorbed everything ever thrown at it, and has no remaining reason to adjust its approach. The approach that had worked 72 times in 11 countries was already executing. Bruce moved backward, not in retreat. The distinction matters enormously, and it was the distinction that the most experienced observers in the building identified in the first 2 seconds. The ones who understood the difference between a man running away and a man conducting the opening movement of a geometry problem he has already solved. Bruce's backward movement was precise, calibrated, maintaining exactly the same distance between himself and the advancing giant with each step. Viktor pushed forward. Bruce glided back. The same interval preserved. Viktor's arms swept inward, trying to compress the space, trying to pin Bruce against the edge of the platform. Bruce circled, tight lateral movement, not wide arcing loops, but small efficient adjustments that kept him just outside the radius of those enormous arms while staying close enough that Viktor never stopped pursuing. This was not avoidance. This was instruction. Every step Viktor took was a step Bruce had designed for him. Every lunge was a response Bruce had scripted. The 800-pound man believed he was hunting. He was being educated. 3 seconds in, Viktor's breathing had already changed. Not from exhaustion. 3 seconds cannot exhaust a body of any size, but from the metabolic reality of what 800 pounds costs in motion. Every step forward was a negotiation between his mass and gravity charged interest on every transaction. His cardiovascular system was already funding a debt that his ambition had created. His lungs worked against the compression of his own chest, which carried more weight than most men's entire bodies. He was built for contact, for the moment when his hands found a body and his weight became decisive. He was not built for pursuit. Bruce had understood this from row 7. A structure carrying 800 pounds is a structure in permanent conversation with its own weight. Make it move laterally, make it change direction, make it reach and miss. And the conversation becomes an argument that the structure cannot win. 3 seconds of controlled movement, and Viktor's face was already flushed, his footfalls marginally less precise, his breath audible in the first 4 rows. At 4 seconds, Bruce stopped moving. He planted, still and centered, positioned slightly to Viktor's left. The giant saw the stillness and did what his body had been trained across 72 fights to do. His left arm drove outward in a sweeping grab, a massive hooking motion that had closed around 60 human torsos and ended every argument it had ever entered. The arm was fast for something attached to 800 pounds. It was not fast enough. Bruce dropped. Not dramatically, not a sprawling defensive collapse, but a compact 8-inch lowering of his entire frame that allowed Viktor's forearm to pass through the space where Bruce's head had been a fraction of a second before. The miss pulled Viktor's torso into rotation. His weight followed his arm, shifting left, and his right side opened completely. His right knee, bearing the asymmetric load of 780 pounds driving through a committed lunge, was for one precise critical instant the sole structural pillar supporting the majority of his frame. Bruce's right leg moved, not upward, not spinning, not dramatic. A low, direct linear side kick, the heel of his foot targeting the exterior of Viktor's right knee at an angle that exploited the one axis of force that a human knee joint is not designed to resist. Lateral pressure against a loaded hinge carrying 800 pounds. The impact produced a sound that every person in the first 6 rows heard clearly, and that several of them later described as the sound that changed their understanding of what a human body was capable of producing when directed by a mind that understood mechanics completely. Viktor's right leg buckled inward. Not a full collapse. The mass of muscle surrounding the joint prevented complete failure. But enough. Enough that his balance, already compromised by the missed grab and the rotation that followed it, became unrecoverable. 800 pounds began to fall. The falling was slow, the way the largest things always fall slowly. The way a building in demolition takes longer to reach the ground than logic suggests it should. Viktor's enormous frame tilted right, his compromised knee unable to provide the corrective force that 800 pounds of tilting mass required. His left foot drove down hard, trying to anchor, trying to redistribute, but the platform surface offered nothing, and the momentum was already committed to a direction his structure could not reverse. His arms reached for air that could not support him. 18,000 people watched 800 pounds of undefeated dominance lose its argument with gravity in what felt like an extended moment, but lasted less than 2 seconds. Viktor's right knee found the platform first. Then his right hand slammed down. The wooden surface produced a sound that was audible in the mezzanine, a deep resonant impact that the platform's structural supports transmitted into the floor and then into the seats. He was on one knee, his face contorted with pain and with something that the people in the first 3 rows could identify clearly and would describe consistently in the years that followed. Bewilderment. Pure, complete, total bewilderment. He had not been on the ground in a fight in 15 years. His body did not have a vocabulary for what it was currently experiencing. Bruce stepped back. He did not press forward. He did not advance on the kneeling giant. He returned to a neutral position, hands at his sides, weight balanced, breathing unchanged. He watched Viktor with the focused attention of someone who has performed a precise operation and is now monitoring the patient. There was no expression on his face that could be described as triumph. There was no performance for the crowd. There was only the specific quality of attention that Bruce Lee brought to everything, complete and undiminished, and aimed entirely at the information in front of him. The building was making a sound that had no clean description. It was not cheering, not yet, because cheering requires a level of certainty about what has occurred that the audience had not yet achieved. It was the sound of 18,000 people trying to verify what their eyes had just sent to their brains. People were standing, craning forward, grabbing the arms of whoever was sitting next to them. Viktor pushed himself upright. It required effort that was visible from the mezzanine. He straightened slowly, testing the damaged knee, redistributing his weight with the careful assessment of a man who has just discovered that one of his foundations is cracked. He turned to face Bruce. His face had changed completely. The theatrical confidence had gone. The amusement with which he had watched Bruce climb the stairs had gone. What remained on Viktor Sokolov's face was something that his manager, who knew that face across 15 years and 11 countries, later said he had never seen there before. Not fear, exactly. Something more precise than fear. The recognition of a specific and unfamiliar danger. The recognition that the small man across the platform had not yet shown him what he was capable of, and was making a considered decision about how much of it to reveal. Bruce moved forward, not circling, not patient and measured as he had been in the opening seconds, but directly, 3 quick strides that closed the distance before Viktor's damaged structure could process the change in approach. His left fist extended in a straight punch that found Viktor's solar plexus, that dense cluster of nerves behind the lower sternum. The punch traveled 6 inches, 6 inches from the point of extension to the point of contact. But behind those 6 inches was everything that 20 years of refinement had produced. Force generated in the rear foot, amplified through hip rotation, concentrated through the core, delivered through the fist at a speed that witnesses later described with a consistent formulation. They said they saw his arm extend. They did not see the punch. Gregor's diaphragm seized. 800 pounds of mass folded around the point of impact, the way a controlled demolition folds a building around its foundation charges, inward, collapsing toward the source of the disruption. The air left his body in a sound that carried across the platform and into the first 8 rows. A deep, involuntary bark, the sound that a body makes when its respiratory system is interrupted without warning or consent. His hands dropped from any semblance of a defensive position to wrap around his own midsection. His eyes widened. His mouth opened. No words came from it, because words require a diaphragm that is functioning, and Viktor's diaphragm was not, at that moment, functioning. He staggered. His damaged right knee absorbed the redistribution of his shifting weight and communicated its objection immediately. He took one backward step, and then another, and then his legs delivered their final assessment of the situation, which was that they were done, that the negotiation with gravity was over, and that the outcome of that negotiation was going to be the floor. He went to both knees. The platform did not groan this time. It cracked. A single sharp report from somewhere in the supporting structure beneath the surface, the sound of wood making its own complaint about the load it had been asked to bear. Viktor was on both knees, his hands pressed to his midsection, his forehead lowered, his breathing a series of short, desperate attempts to convince his diaphragm to resume its responsibilities. 8 seconds had passed since Harold Weeks brought his hand down. Weeks reached Viktor in 4 strides. He knelt beside the giant, assessing, speaking in the quick, urgent shorthand of a referee who has seen a fighter hurt and is running through the checklist of how hurt. Viktor's manager was already on the platform, having climbed the stairs at a speed that suggested he had been positioned to climb them the moment things went wrong. He was speaking in Ukrainian, rapid and alarmed, his hands hovering over Viktor's shoulders without quite landing. But before either Weeks or the manager could reach a conclusion, Viktor raised one hand from his midsection. The hand was enormous, capable of covering a man's entire face. It moved in a lateral sweeping motion, back and forth. The universal gesture that needed no translation in any language spoken in Madison Square Garden that evening, or in any other language spoken anywhere. Stop. It is finished. I am done. He raised his eyes to find Weeks. and the expression in those eyes was described by the four ringside journalists close enough to see it clearly, and all four of them, independently, writing in their own words for their own publications in the weeks that followed, used the same word: pleading. The man who had walked into this building with 72 victories and the specific confidence of someone who has never been asked to reconsider his assumptions was on his knees, looking up at a referee, asking to be released from a contest that had lasted 8 seconds. Weeks stood. He crossed his arms above his head. The match was over. Madison Square Garden produced the kind of noise that the building had heard before, had heard from championship fights and title bouts, and the great moments of sporting theater that its history contained. But the people who were present that night, and who had also been present for those other moments, said later consistently that this sound was different. Not louder necessarily, but different in its quality, different in what it contained. Because the other great noises had been the sounds of expected things happening with unexpected perfection. This was the sound of a category being destroyed. This was 18,000 people discovering simultaneously that something they had assumed was fixed was not fixed, that the architecture of what they believed about size and power and the nature of physical danger had just been renovated in 8 seconds by a man who weighed 138 pounds. Bruce stood at the center of the platform. He had not been touched. His jacket was undisturbed. His breathing was indistinguishable from his breathing at the start of the evening. He did not raise his arms. He did not address the crowd. He did not perform anything for the 18,000 people who were on their feet producing a sound that shook the light fixtures in the mezzanine. He bowed. A single small bow, not toward the audience, but directed at Viktor, who was still on his knees, still attended by Weeks and the manager, still conducting the difficult process of convincing his body that the emergency was over. The bow was not theatrical. It was not condescending. It was the specific bow of someone acknowledging that the person across from them came to the encounter honestly and deserved to be recognized for it. Viktor looked up from the platform floor and saw the bow. He watched Bruce for a long moment. Then, with the assistance of his manager and one of the medical staff who had come onto the platform, he was helped to his feet. He stood unsteadily, his right knee still objecting, his midsection still tender, his breathing still not fully restored. He looked across the platform at the small man in the dark jacket who had just systematically and precisely dismantled everything Viktor Sokolov had built across 15 years and 11 countries in 8 seconds without receiving a single point of contact in return. Viktor spoke. His translator relayed the words. He said he had fought men of every description across every country he had visited. He said he had never once, in any of those fights, experienced a moment of genuine fear. Then he paused. His translator waited. Viktor said that tonight was the second time he had experienced fear. Not during the fight, not when his knee buckled or when his diaphragm seized, but in the moment before the fight, when the small man in row 7 stood up. Viktor said, "I looked at his eyes when he stood, and I knew then. I did not know what he was going to do. I only knew that whatever it was, I was not going to be able to stop it. That was the fear, not the pain, the certainty." Bruce crossed the platform and extended his hand. Viktor looked at it for a moment. Then he took it in both of his enormous hands wrapping entirely around Bruce's. He held on for a long time. The building was still loud around them, still processing, still trying to accommodate what it had witnessed inside its existing understanding of things. Viktor and Bruce stood at the center of the platform, one man's hands wrapped around the other's, and the building roared, and the lights burned overhead. And somewhere in the mathematics of what had just occurred, something had been settled that neither man needed to put into words, because the 8 seconds had already said it more precisely and more permanently than words could manage.